We need to talk about this because it is outrageous that people just lie to you like that. I'm sure you've heard how Jim Hall had this text on his business card. Won't play loud, can't play fast. Which kind of fits his style. His playing is relaxed with an incredibly strong time, good phrasing, and he's very melodic. But after taking his word for it all these years, I recently found out that this isn't true at all. He actually plays songs at more than 260 beats per minute, and he does it very well, adding all sorts of stuff at that tempo. How is that? Can't play fast. But all internet drama aside, this is a great solo with some amazing rhythms, polyrhythms, and especially the phrasing in there is really interesting, and you can learn a lot from it. So let's have a look at it. The song that they're playing is Dizzy Gillespie's Groovin' High, and this is off a Hampton Horse album from 1958 called All Night Sessions Volume 1. Jim Hall is much more about rhythm and melody than just running the changes with 8 notes, and as you can hear, he also chooses to start on this nice chromatic leading note to catch our attention. He's working a lot more with quarter notes than with 8 notes, which is sort of a swing thing, but what you really want to hear here is also all the detail and variation that he's adding to his phrasing. He's not just playing the notes, there's a lot more going on. The first one is this very subtle trill on the Am7 D7 bars. But there are also slides on the E-flat major 7 and G7 C7 phrases. The trill that he's using on Am7 D7, he actually returns to later, but then adds a lot of syncopation. That sounds like this. Throughout the solo, you'll see great examples of how Jim Hall uses phrasing and different techniques to make the phrasing interesting. But he also uses some Barry Harris strategies that are super practical if you're playing fast tempos. But next, let's look at how he's drawing from both swing and bebop strategies. This is so simple, but it sounds so great. And I mentioned earlier how Jim Hall draws a lot from swing, not only bebop. And that of course makes sense because his main influence at this point was probably Charlie Christian, who's also sort of in between those two styles.
He was playing on a tune called Grand Slam, which is a blues in F, and he played 2 choruses. And I remember literally thinking, I don't know what that is, but whatever, I wish I could do that, and it was Charlie Christian.
This whole section is using a lot of repeated notes, which of course is a practical way to play a fast tempo, because if you don't have to think about a lot of notes that you have to play and you can just play one note, then that works. But it only works because he has really good time and the rhythmic or melodic ideas are strong enough. Another thing you want to notice is that when he's playing lines in this section, it's all E-flat major except for one spot. So he's not really digging into the changes or spelling them out, he's relying on other things to make it work. And as you can hear, it clearly works. But that's mainly because the melodies are strong enough. You might think, well, he's just faking it and making it easier for himself by just playing E-flat major over the whole thing, but don't think that he can't play the changes because he is nailing them later in the solo. In fact, he even starts using polyrhythms on top of the song, and that was probably not that common so early in jazz history. Remember that this is in 1958. This is all a choice, and that really becomes clear later in the solo. Most of the time I talk about bebop in the videos, mainly because that is sort of the large foundation for what we consider mainstream jazz. Swing phrasing also has a place in there, also just to be able to play something that isn't only 8 notes. And that can also be a great way to get more out of syncopation when you do use that. Check this out. The first part of this is actually just a pentatonic pickup. And then he plays the third of the chord, so G in this case, on the heavy beats, beat 1 and 3, before adding an embellishment around that third. But because the first part is so heavy and clear on the beat, then the contrast is a lot larger, so that makes it work a lot better. You really hear that now he's doing something with the rhythm. Filling the whole thing up with 8 notes would not really give you that effect. And you can actually see that he's just thinking D7 on the Am7 D7 because he really comes out on that F sharp at the beginning of those 2 bars, and the phrase is really just D major pentatonic. And then you get the Pat Metheny lick, which is then actually a Jim Hall lick that Pat Metheny stole. I'm not sure which Jim Hall albums Pat Metheny checked out, but I suspect this was one of them. If you know which albums he checked out, let me know about that in the comments. I'm of course talking about this phrase with the repeated notes. And the next part is super simple, but this way of using phrasing is fantastic, and it's a really nice way to use a motif through a 2/5. It actually kind of blew my mind. So you have this simple 3-note phrase, and then that's repeated, but now it's moving from G-7 to C7, and then he does this. Let's check out some polyrhythms and some chromaticism. But first, I want to just talk a little bit about Jim Hall's sound on this, which, as far as I can tell, is the same setup as what he's using on his debut album, just titled Jazz Guitar, which came out in 1957. So the year before this, which came out in 1958. Editing Jens here, so I looked this up, and it turns out that actually the Hampton Horse album was recorded first, because that was recorded in November of 1956, and then the Jim Hall Trio album was recorded early 1957 in January, so they're 8 weeks apart. So he's probably using the same amp and the same guitar. As far as I can tell, it's Jim Hall playing his ES-175 into a Gibson amp, and the sound is very dry. Now, if you've seen the video on my 175, then you know that I sometimes found myself fighting against the lack of sustain. When I hear the expression thunk, then this is the sound that I think of. But if you know a better example, then let me know about that in the comments. So the star of this is of course that chromatic run that's part of the melody that's sort of shifting on top of the meter here. And notice that he's really emphasizing the sharp 11 on the F7. In fact, this is just built around a G major triad on top of the F7, so really a Lydian dominant sound. But the rhythm is really what's important here. So the first time he just plays that and repeats it. And then he moves it up, but he keeps it practical. And I think this is also clearly something that's improvised, because he changes it to keep it playable, and he does that by just leaving out the last part of the phrase and only play that chromatic run. But then he keeps on shifting that as well. Finally moving it up, and then actually getting back to the original phrase and going down the arpeggio, like an A-flat minor 7 arpeggio. And this is used to transition back into that last B-flat 7 phrase that resolves to E-flat major. Now, most of the stuff that he borrowed from swing until now has been about the rhythm, but I think this next phrase also really shows how he's using some swing note choices. The opening of this second chorus is really emphasizing the 6 and using the E-flat major 6 sound, which you could also describe as major pentatonic, since the major pentatonic scale really is just a major 6/9 chord. An E-flat major triad, plus a 9 and a 6. But the melody in this case is really going for that 6 in a way that is maybe stronger than most places where you hear major pentatonic being used. You can also again hear how he's really thinking like Barry Harris and not really playing A-7, D7, but just playing D7 for those 2 bars. The next phrase is an example of how you can create lines by thinking in terms of chord tones and leading notes, more than just thinking in scales. Here is an E-flat major triad with a leading note that also really brings out the sharp 11 of the chord. And this is of course similar to how I've talked about George Benson, Grant Green and Charlie Parker are sometimes creating lines as well. As you can tell, then it is the melodic clarity and the rhythm that I really like about Jim Hall's playing. And I really think that he does that so incredibly well as an improviser. Another guitarist that has this type of attention to melody and also to fitting into the context is Bill Frisell. To me, he may be sort of the next Jim Hall. If you want to check out his playing, then check out this video on a beautiful chord melody arrangement of his.